inside the recording studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me is Mr. Chris Hellstrom, as always. How you doing, Chris?
As always, I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing, Jody?
I'm doing all right myself. I am barefoot at the moment in the studio. Good thing you can't see that because I probably have heinous toenails. I'm just kidding.
Oh, again, overshare, man. Overshare.
That's kind of the point of this. We're oversharing about everything we do.
That's
in terms
right.
of recording, mostly.
Yeah, well, hopefully. But as we like to say, it's not unlikely that there'll be some nonsense discussed. So.
And toenails, there's definitely nonsense.
Yeah, yes, firmly planted in that category. So, yeah. So,
and with that, today, we're going to transition into what are we talking about today other than toenails?
I'm done talking about your toenails now. But we're going to talk about the 1176 compressor. We're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into it today and how you and I use it, a little bit of the history of it, hardware and software. So, should be fun.
I think so. Where shall we start? We should start by saying, what kind of compressor is the 1176? And if you have never heard of the 1176 before, we feel sorry for you, but this episode should change all of that.
Yeah, no, I think when you talk about 1176, it's one of those like series of numbers that just means something to people that do recording and stuff.
It's like a secret handshake code for recording engineers.
Yeah, and yeah, if somebody doesn't know that, that's somebody that you don't want in your life. No,
don't associate with you kind of people.
Yeah, no, but in all seriousness, it is a very classic sort of compressor.
Classic because it came out when?
First one came out, I believe, in 1968. Ooh. And that
definitely
would have
classic year. Yeah.
Yeah, that would have been the Uray Universal Audio version.
Right.
And what makes this one a little special, it's a really, really, really fast compressor. And it's certainly
fast in terms of its attack ratio or its ability to start clamping down on things.
Yes. It's very fast, a little bit more flexible, shall we say, on the release, or at least a wider range.
Yes.
We'll talk about numbers here in a second, but it imparts a certain sound, and some people would argue that anything that you put through it would make it sound cooler or better. So
what goes in sounds better on the way out.
Yeah, what comes, exactly. But it is at least the original ones were a solid state compressor. No
all transistors say that 10 times fast. All transistor circuitry.
Yeah. And
no
went through a few revisions. But I think that the big ones that we think about is what's known as the blue stripe, which was the original one.
Yes.
Then we obviously those are still in use today in a lot of studios. Like, well, all of these are.
Well, know, if you are lucky enough to own the hardware version, you've got a piece of history.
Yeah, sure. I think Andrew Shep said in an interview once that, when they were in his studio, when he had his racks and racks and he had all his 1176s and all his outboard gear, he said, yeah, that's my retirement account right there. So,
because they do go for a lot of money on those original units.
Yeah, they do that. But so moving on from the blue stripe, we came into what's known as the black face, which is black, as it were, hence the name.
Yes.
The goal with that, from my understanding, was that they wanted to make it a little bit friendlier sounding. It's a little bit cleaner. The blue stripe it's quite aggressive, shall we say. So this was to make it sound a little bit cleaner, that kind of thing.
Cleaner.
And and they do. We'll go into this later on, but when we're talking about the software world, that there is a difference in the way that these have been emulated as well, as one would expect.
Right.
And then the last revision, I think, which at least to my knowledge is sort of like the little lesser version, or not lesser version, but certainly lesser known version, I would say.
Yeah,
At least in my world, a limited view of them. But that's just the silver face. That was the last one that I think that
silver
Universal and Uray did before
silver
the reissues. Silver.
Silver.
Yeah. There was a company called, there is a company called Purple Audio that started reproducing these, again, reissues of these in the 90s, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So there are more sort of like modern takes on these. I guess reading up on this a little bit, they realized that there were a lot of these old units coming into repair shops, that had, at this point, obviously they've been in use for, conservatively probably 20 to 25 years, right? So a lot of repairs, and they said, okay, well, maybe we should start manufacturing these again. And there was a company called Purple Audio that did those.
Right.
Also Retro Instruments have one as well. They're, as one would expect, a little bit more modern construction. So they might have some functionality that was not present on
the original boxes.
The original ones, yeah.
There's also a stomp box called the Cali 76.
That's right. So
that is to emulate the 1176 for guitar players before maybe they do it after their guitar amp, but to compress your
guitar. If you want that kind of sound on your on the floor, as it were, in your guitar rig, it would be a little bit I think over the top, having, especially if you're running a stereo rig, right? You got two 1176s sitting in the bottom of your rack, and
that could get real pricey real fast.
It can, yeah. So that's sort of like, maybe we should talk a little bit about, how we would apply these, or how we would use them, and why are they so popular?
Well, maybe before we even get into that, we might want to just discuss a few things that we've kind of glossed over. We've talked about the fact that it's an all transistor circuitry type compressor, which is otherwise known as an FET type of piece of gear. FET. Right. It is an ultra fast gain reduction. They call it a limiting amplifier, I guess they call it, in a sense.
Yeah, peak limiting amplifier, yeah.
And in previous episodes, I tend to refer to the 1176 more as a limiter than a compressor, but it is a limiting compressor.
Yeah.
In addition to that, why they call it a very fast or ultra fast type of system is because its actual attack times range from 20 microseconds to 800 microseconds. So
not milliseconds,
microseconds. So it is extremely fast for certain applications, depending, and everything is below a microsecond up to 0.8 of a millisecond. The release, as you mentioned, is substantially wider on its range. It releases anywhere from 50 milliseconds, which is substantially longer than the microsecond, to up to about a little over a second.
Yeah.
At its lengthiest release.
Right.
So that's the reasoning behind why it's, like, to me, more of a limiter than a compressor, because it is so ridiculously fast on how it can clamp down on sounds.
Yeah.
But it is still considered a limiting compressor or a limiting amplifier type.
Yeah, I think the terminology came about from that, just limiting peaks, right? So peak limiting amplifier, as opposed to peak, much like we're talking right now, peaks.
That's right. So the other thing too is, if we just kind of delve in just a little bit on these different revisions, the blue stripe, which is silver face with this big blue stripe on it.
Yeah, had a VU meter there type of thing.
Yep. Had a couple of different incarnations with the revision A, which was the very beginning. Then they went with the A, B, and the B. So there's 3 different versions of the blue stripe that are kind of out there, originally by Uray Universal Audio.
Yep.
Then there is the black face. And while most people refer to it as revision E, there were multiple revisions of that with C through the letter G. Count that up on your own hand. And then there is yet another revision by Universal Audio that is known as the AE. And it's not like trying to combine the original Blueface A and the revision E version. It is called the AE because it's called the Anniversary Edition. The big difference on the AE version of the 1176 is that instead of having the 4 type of ratio buttons, because it does have 4 different ratios that you can use individually. And up until the AE, it was 4-to-1, 8-to-1, 16-to-1, and 20-to-1 on its compression ratio. With the Anniversary Edition, it's a little bit different. It's 2-to-1, 4-to-1, 8-to-1, 20-to-1.
Look at that. I learned something today. I didn't know that there was a 2-to-1. Yeah.
Yes, that's why the AE is that extra special Anniversary Edition, is because it's got the smallest ratio of ability in 2-to-1 instead of an immediate 4-to-1 on that. Right. Now, in addition to that, we'll get into this a little later, but you can go beyond those 4 settings for the ratios.
Yeah, yeah. And let's I guess we can talk about it now, but one issue one sort of functionality that we'll go in more as well, but we talked about how they have a certain characteristic,
Yes.
they impart on the sound. So you can actually run through these units and bypass the compression just to import that sound as well. So it's,
What is, and people are known to do that.
Yes. Yeah. And you can do it subtly or you can do it not so subtly, but yeah. So you can do that as well. But now that I sort of let the genie
actually,
out of the
I
bottle.
should probably say one more thing about the Anniversary Edition that I just spaced on. Not only does it have a lower compression ratio of a 2-to-1, it also has a super slow attack mode, so to speak. 10 milliseconds.
Ooh, that's an eternity.
Yeah.
Wow. Again, I've learned 2 things today. I got to listen to this podcast more often.
You might learn something, Chris.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. I honestly didn't know that.
Yes.
Is that the but is that the one that came out then when did that come out? That's not the reissue then in 2000 or whatever, or is this when did that come out?
That's a good question. I did not
I'm putting you on the spot here. I know.
It's 40 years after the original. So
okay,
if 68, that would
98.
be 2008, 98.
2008. Yeah.
Somewhere in that range. Yeah. Is when that came out. Yeah.
Okay. So that is the more modern air quote version of that then. Yeah.
Yes, sir. 40th Anniversary Edition.
Right. And of course there's, besides the companies that we mentioned now, there
multiple
several
companies
more
that make them.
Yeah, they make them now, and there's even kits that if you're handy with soldering iron, that kind of thing, that you can actually build them. There's a guy in Germany has a great website called Mixed by Mozart. He goes by he did an episode in his studio where I think his studio partner or assistant had built some of these kits and really, really enjoyed them. So that's another route if you want to go the pure hardware route.
Pure hardware. And right now we're about to transition. We're going to transition from talking about the pure hardware. And before we transition into what we're about to talk about with the 1176, we're going to take a moment for a word from our sponsors. All right, and we're back. We are going to be talking about software versions of the 1176 at this point.
Sure. So, as one would expect, there's a lot of different versions of these as well.
Yes, there are.
And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but I'd be remiss to actually probably mention off the top of my, there might have been others as well, but when I first became aware of these in the software world was the Waves versions, like the CLA bundle that had the 1176, both his blue stripe and the black face, and a couple of other ones in there. But since we're talking about that,
so that would be the Chris Lord Algae versions.
That would, yeah, that'd be the Chris Lord Algae. Yes,
or is it Chris Lord Algae?
Algae.
Algae.
Algae. That's the way he says it anyway. So I'm assuming he is right. But you're a Universal Audio guy. So
yes,
they obviously have their version.
That is correct. They actually have quite a few versions of the 1176 in their Apollo software.
Yeah,
they have the 1176 LN legacy version. They have an LNSE legacy version, which is the special edition. They have the 1176 AE, the 1176E blackface, and the 1176A blue stripe. So there's about, 5 different applications of 1176 limiters in the Apollo software.
So pick your flavor.
That's right.
I would be remiss to not mention Slate because I'm a Slate user.
That's right.
And there as well, there's there's 3 different versions in that package. There's, sort of like the blackface, there's the blue stripe, and then there's one that is, again, air quotes here, a modern version of that, which has, it's essentially a modded blue stripe that, again, has a little bit of a slower attack time. So that can be, used as well. And different versions there with, that we have in the software world with, low pass filters before it hits the compression stage and that kind of thing, and all that. But we'll go into functionality a little bit. I just recently tried out as well. I mentioned Purple Audio.
Mm-hmm.
They actually did the hardware unit, obviously, and how Brainworks, another favorite company of mine, have a software version of that one as well. And
the MC77.
There you go.
Why would they call it the 77 and not the 76, though? That's a little strange.
I think they did that just because there was an update on it. And I don't think they possibly couldn't even call it the 1176. But MC is obviously Roman numerals for 1100. So
gotcha.
1177. See what they did there? Crafty.
Yeah.
But that's another great version. And obviously with software, there's some functionality that were not present in the original
hardware versions, right?
Units.
Unless they were modified.
Unless they were modified, yeah. But there are others. T-Rax makes one. There's, I think everybody pretty much makes an 1176. There's
one that even comes inside Logic.
There's 2 that even comes inside.
Well,
Logic.
it's 2, but it's in the Logic compressor. They have 2 different settings that represent 2 different versions of the 1176. They have the Studio FET, which is probably closest to the Revision E blackface version. Yeah. And then they have the Vintage FET setting, which is a lot like the Revision A blue stripe.
Yeah. And those are, getting those characteristics, but in Logic there, you have, instead of going for complete emulation, you have more flexibility when it comes to the attack and release and that kind of stuff, right? So they're everywhere.
They're everywhere, and that's because it's a classic.
Yeah, and it sounds good.
Funny how that is.
Yeah, so there's a reason why everybody emulates them, right? Just like in any other software world. But why is it everybody got the Juno 8 synthesizer revision or a Moog, or why is people trying to do a Marshall emulation with amps? Because they're good and people like that kind of sound.
Well, and the other thing to think about, and just kind of describing why people pick up on certain things, it's either the sound of the unit itself, or it's the ease of use.
There's that as well. Yeah,
the ease of use, and that's where the 1176 is pretty darn cool.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the controls that we have on the.
There's an input knob where you can go from 0 to infinity on your input, which is pretty good range of volume gain that you can add to this signal that you're sending it through. There's an output knob that you can then take it from no output to as loud as the 1176 will go. Beyond that, we have the attack and release knobs.
Mm-hmm.
And those allow you to set those on the attack, that very small range of 20 to 800 microseconds, or if you have the AE version, the 10 milliseconds. And then the release knob runs from obviously 50 milliseconds up to 1.1 seconds in terms of what it does. The thing about those knobs, though, is that
really important.
The really important thing about these dial knobs for the attack and the release is that most compressors, if you're at 0, that's your slowest setting.
Or in this case, the 1, right?
The 1, or wherever you're going to start. The interesting thing about the 1176, these knobs are quote unquote backwards.
Yes.
Such that when it is rotated fully left, that's your slowest, that's like your slowest setting. On most compressors, that would be your fastest setting, right? Is that the way, am I explaining it right?
Yeah.
And then if you're fully right, on the 1176 with the attack or release knob, that is your fastest attack and your fastest release.
Yeah.
So for most people, they think that you're going to start at your fastest on the left and move to the slowest on the right. With the 1176, that is exactly backwards. It is the slowest on the left and fastest on the right.
Yeah.
So that is something that is very important to pay attention to.
Yeah.
When you're doing
it's actually good. I would say as a workflow thing, it's probably a good idea when you start dialing those in that start with the sort of slowest attack, which would be completely
left
counterclockwise. I have to think about this in my head to make sure I say the right thing. And with the release all the way up, right? So the longest release. And normally for a lot of compressors, that might be you're catching very little, but this has
such an
important flavor. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's a good place to start. Now, one thing with the input and output knob here, if you're not aware or haven't worked with any of these, there is no threshold setting.
No.
It's a fixed threshold. So the input knob will dictate how much compression you're getting.
Or how much signal you're sending through the threshold that is already set in the unit.
Right. Yeah. But you know, you raise the input level and you'll get more gain reduction, which you can then compensate for with the output or however you want to drive the unit. But there is no threshold setting that you lower or raise on this. It's a set threshold.
It is a set threshold. So you will use your input knob to determine how hard you're going to drive the unit, essentially.
Yeah. Right. And that's something we mentioned when we talked about mixing vocals, I believe, when we talked about vocal compression and things, how again, the Chris Lord-Alge versions of these, they were set a default at his sweet spot.
For what he determines as a sweet spot.
Well, for his units, right. Which is the one that's emulated, right? That how he would use essentially the clip gain heading into the plugin in this case to get his desired peak reduction without doing that. So it's a little bit of a different way of working, I guess.
Sure.
But it's something that you can mess around with. But normally it'd be the input that tells you how much compression you'd be getting by how hard you're hitting it.
Right.
Yeah.
There are 8 other things that we need to talk about in terms of the controls on this unit.
Let's do it.
4 of them are the ratio buttons.
Yes.
So there are 4 ratio buttons. Mm-hmm. And in most units, that is 4, 8, 16, and 20 choices. 4 to 1, 8 to 1, 16 to 1, 20 to 1 on your compression ratios.
Yeah.
Then on the anniversary edition, as mentioned earlier, it's 2, 4, 8, and 20, I think is the 4 choices on the anniversary edition. In addition to that, people would do crazy stuff with the ratio buttons, and they would actually push in 2 of them at the same time, or 3 of them at the same time, or all 4 of them at the same time. Yeah. And that actually causes the unit to do drastically different things with the compression ratio. So there's a lot of experimentation that can be done fairly easily with the 1176. By switching in and out multiple ratio buttons. Now, I don't think this was how it was originally intended to ever be used. It was just one of those happy accidents that somebody probably went and shoved all the buttons in at one point, and it was considered the all buttons in version that is like really drives a certain character into the sound. And I mean, it really grinds it in there. So
yeah. Because I think also, like you said, there was the possibility then, like you said, we normally have like 4, 8,
16,
4, 8,
20.
16, and 20, right? So if you press 4 and 8, that would be a 12-to-1 ratio type of thing. But I do think the threshold reacts a little bit differently. I might be wrong on this, but I do think it's not. I think the threshold of the compression is dependent on the ratio as well. So you might have to experiment with that a little bit. I don't think it's for want of a better phrase, I don't think it's linear in that way.
And that being said, there is one other way that these buttons can be used on the ratio buttons, and that is no buttons pushed in at all, which you kind of hinted at, where you could just use it without the compression.
Right.
On the other side of the VU meter, there's 4 more buttons, and those are dealt or dealing with the way the actual meter is going to run. And you can set it for how much gain reduction, so you can see how much you're crushing the signal. Then you can also set it for the various types of outputs, or you can turn it off in terms of how much output, in terms of like the amount of signal that you got, whether you're doing a +4 type of situation or whatnot. So you can use this in other environments other than the studio in that regard, and still be able to meter with it.
Yeah, but that's one of you're essentially different ways of viewing what the VU meter is doing or the virtual VU meter at this point, right? So you can keep an eye on that. I think personally, 99.95 times of 100, I'm watching my gain reduction on that.
I don't think I've ever used any of the other settings. I literally look at to see how much it's gain reducing. Beyond that, I'm using my ear for the volume level.
Yeah, right. And that, as compressors as a whole, that's something that I know that I used to make that mistake very often early on, where the more you compress, generally, if you don't compensate with the output, you get a louder signal. So that sounds better. So that's great. So you just ending up basically boosting levels. So
because louder is better, man. Louder is more. More is better. Less is not more. Less is less. More is more. Damn it.
That's right. So compress the crap out of them and just but it is easy to fool yourself, especially if you're being your compressed signal to the dry signal.
Correct.
So you do want to make sure that you match your levels when you're working with any compressor, really. But this is obviously no exception.
No exceptions.
And,
and
very few controls there. Yeah.
In my discussion of using the ratio buttons, that is considered the special ways of using it, when you're using multiple buttons at once.
Yeah. Right.
Or the no button method.
Right. And one thing that is obviously different in the software world now, as opposed to the old hardware units, where they were just mono units. They weren't stereo units. So if you wanted to run them, let's say, on a whole mix, well, you needed to have two. Right?
Yes. One for each side. And then hopefully they were set up or built so similarly that you wouldn't notice the difference on side to side.
Yeah. But today we have obviously options of running them just stereo or dual mono, that kind of thing. And the Brainworks version of the MC77 that I've been playing with a little bit has some additional functionality. You can actually do like a mid-side thing with it, where you can even spread the stereo field. Yeah. So there's additional benefits to that, if that's something that you want to do. But it's a really, really cool sounding. So probably I think what we should do for the 2 Minute Tuesday, because it's hard to talk about, the sound of something. We should probably play some audio clips how we might use an 1176, just so we can have kind of like an A and B signal there. So for listeners to actually hear that if they haven't used them before. So I think that might be
yes,
a good
I
idea.
agree with that. That would be a good 2-minute Tuesday. So pay attention to that. That will be coming out this coming Tuesday.
Yes.
Where you can hear examples of A/B of the 1176 on, say, vocals or guitars or bass or drums or whatever.
Yeah. So speaking of usage, where do you like to use it? What's the first one that you kind of go to?
Get a shot glass ready because it's program dependent.
I'll have a swig of coffee. How about that? Cheers.
A little cheers of tea for me. Yeah, it's program dependent. And my first introduction to the difference of an 1176 came in the studio with Mr. George Leger, actually.
Yeah.
Another mention, shout out to George, who is a fantastic recording and mixing engineer in his own right.
Absolutely.
We compared the vocal sound of a C12, which is the mic that you're actually hearing me through for this podcast, running through an Avalon Avalon 737 SP. And then we ran it through an 1176. And on the particular song that I had first done this kind of A/B comparison from one unit to another of two completely different compressors, it was like, wow, the way it's parted. It was like, you know what? That fits the vibe of the song better using the 1176. It had a little bit more grit. It had a little bit more bite to the sound. And speaking of which, right now on this particular podcast, actually it's on all the podcast episodes, you are hearing the effect of an 1176, not only on my voice, but you're also hearing it on Chris's voice as well. So you're hearing the product of an 1176 use in this podcast. So there you go. And it's on all podcast episodes. We've been using it. So yeah.
Do you remember what you were comparing it to? What was the other unit?
The Avalon 737?
No. You said you had the 1176 in conjunction with that. Oh, but are you... So
no,
this was
my original comparison was between running a C12 through an Avalon 737 and then running the C12 through an 1176.
Oh, okay. I got
so
you.
that's what I was hearing the difference of. And that's where I was like, for that particular song where that first came like to my attention, it was like, whoa. Because the Avalon 737 is no slouch of its own like mic pre-compressor unit box. It's a fantastic box. But when we ran that same vocal through an 1176 and tried out the 1176, it was like, to me, it was like, there's the sound of this song. Let's use the 1176 instead of the Avalon.
Do you remember if it was a blackface or a blue stripe or what?
It was the blackface.
Yeah.
So it was the cleaner of the two. It wasn't the blue face, which is considered a little bit more gritty. No, it was the blackface. So it still imparted enough grit in the blackface version. And thinking about that, is that a terminology that's going to go away now due to whole like the political correctness and BLM movement? Just wondering, just thinking out loud, because we're trying to get rid of all kinds of other things, but here we are calling a particular box a particular terminology. So strange.
I'm not going to touch that.
Yeah. Well, I just did. Now I'm going to pull back and just say the 1176 revision E. Is the version that we ran it through, and it imparted such a nice vibe to that song and that vocal. It was like, yep, that's the ticket right there. So that's part of the reason for having different boxes in the studio, because you never know what's actually going to get exactly the right sound until you experiment with it.
Yeah.
So this is why certain bands will spend a week just getting the tones of a recording before they even record something, is because they spend the time, setting up instruments. So if the guitar is going to be going through like SM7 or 57 and a Royer 121. Well, are you going to run both of those mics through the same compressor, or are you going to run any compression, or are you going to try certain different things on that signal? Same thing with a vocalist. You know, you might have the right mic that accentuates the vocalist's natural tonality. But then when you add the compressor to it, are you adding the right compression?
Yeah.
Do you need something that's a little softer, or do you need something that has a little bit more bite? So these are all questions that you have to ask yourself as you're kind of going through adding those. But we've already kind of discussed this in other episodes, and we're trying to stick to the 1176 here now. So to answer your question, it really, as I said before, it's program dependent. There are times when I want something that has a real fast attack to it because I need that extra clamp that happens to just kind of bring the beef out in the sound. So yeah, I do find myself using the 1176 more often on rock-based tracks or things that have a heavier vibe. That being said, I have also used it on straight up acoustic tracks. Like on acoustic guitar, it does a very lovely job on acoustic guitar.
I agree. Absolutely. I really like it on acoustic guitars as well. I like it on drums.
Well, yeah, drums have such a fast attack that the 1176 is almost like it was a match made in heaven for how fast a drum hit is and how fast the 1176 can deal with it.
It is really easy to overdo it though, because you can, if you're not careful, you can just, you know, you're sitting there and you're listening. Oh, this sounds so exciting, and then all of a sudden, there's no dynamics left in your drum tracks. But again, another beauty of software versions of these, that several of them have a mix knob, so you're essentially doing like a parallel compression in the same channel strip, where you can have, let's say, a really aggressive setting on a room track, for example, where you can really, really crush the room mics, but then dial it back a little bit if you just want that effect and kind of mix that. So
yes, and as a way of kind of expressing that, I have channel strip presets that I use when I go from my tracking template to my mix template. And I will bring up like full presets for drums and other things. And the 1176 on drums, especially for the room mics, man, you can get some tasty tones out of room mics with the 1176.
Yeah.
And then you just dial it back because you want the air and the space, but you don't want it to overpower the rest of the kit.
Yeah. No, there's also another thing that, you know, as you're drinking here, I say it is content dependent, right?
Yes.
Where depending on the mix, now I've said this in the past, especially talking about drums, but a lot of times I won't use a room mic depending on the situation, because it has the potential to fill up so much space. But if you have, let's say that you have a 3-piece or 4-piece or more of just like, let's say an indie rock band type of thing, you kind of want that dirt of the room. So it does an amazing job on that. So my go-tos are usually vocals. That's the first vocal mic I tend to do.
You mean vocal compressor?
Vocal compressor. Yeah. Oh, I said vocal mic.
Yes, you did.
I am not from your country.
Yeah, you Swede.
Yeah, I know that's my cop out for everything when I say something stupid. But no, as a vocal compressor, I do like the 1176. And depending on what works there and depending on the singer, it would be either the blue stripe or, you know, the blackface version. And again, content dependent, right? I do like it on acoustic guitars. Drums, like I said, I will usually have it on, like I said, room, great for that. I will a lot of times have it on like snare and kick, but not as aggressive, but just to get that little extra snap out of those. But that's, you know, you can pretty much throw it on anything as long as you're careful enough, especially with the release knob, because you can kill that pretty quickly and it just sounds like a typewriter, you know.
Get rid of all the dynamics.
Yeah, and it's just there's no release either. And if you go for an effect, cool, have at it. But it is very easy to overcook them. But overall, I think the 1176 is a fantastic compressor, and it certainly in one way or another finds itself into, I dare say, just about every mix that I do. There's something there anyway that will have an 1176 on it.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. For a lot of, maybe not quite as many as the high percentage as you, but at least 80% of my mixes probably has an 1176 somewhere, whether it's on an individual instrument or on a bus.
Yeah, it can do really good stuff on percussion tracks as well.
Yes.
Like if you have, let's say, if you have like something as a shaker or a tambourine that can be very sort of like spiky, you can just poke those levels in a little bit and have that be a little bit more present.
Yep.
Yeah, fantastic compressor.
And there you have it. That is our kind of a deep dive into the history of the 1176, the different types of the 1176, and us saying you should go get an 1176 and use the damn thing.
Yeah, but please pay attention to your attack and release times. That's kind of like key for everything. But yeah, it's a great sounding unit. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it that I would like to call on that. Anything that you would like to add to that, Jody?
I'm thinking about next week's episode. We're going to be reversing the tables of last week's episode, where you were asking me questions about the biggest recording lessons ever learned. This time, I'm going to be asking you about your biggest recording lessons you've ever learned. That's next week's episode.
Ooh, I'll have to think about that a little bit.
Yes, stay tuned for next week. I think we're going to say see you